is Tara. Today let us study Sutra number 7. What does it say? Pratyaksha, Anumana, Agamaha, Pramanani. What does that mean? Pratyaksha, Anumana and Agama are proofs. In Maharshi Vedavyasa's commentary, he basically says that perception, verbal cognition and inference are real cognitions. This is how it is translated by Sri Ramaprasada with Sri Vachaspati Mishra's glossary. So, how does he explain these? Perception is the mental modification. So, perception is the mental modification. What is the function of this mental modification? It cognizes the appearance of an object and being of the nature of specific and generic. So it recognizes whether the characteristics of the object are specific to the object or generic to all objects like the object or of the class of objects. And it, by means of the impression that it casts upon the chitta through the senses, this is how we perceive. Now, inference is the mental modification which is also known as sequential cognition. So, for instance, if you pick up a fruit and you see it the first time, it's the first time I'm seeing this fruit, this is actually the first time I'm seeing this fruit, it's like, oh, new, it's direct perception. And then I put it down and I say, oh, do you remember that fruit I just showed you? Okay, where are you drawing it up from? You're drawing it up from memory. That is sequential cognition. Or let's say this is the second time I show it to you. This is your second perception of it. And part of your perception of it is coming from the memory of the first one. So let's say a week has passed and I bring up this fruit. You will mentally compare it to the first time you saw this fruit. So it is sequential cognition. It is the second time, or now it's the third time you're seeing it. So inferential cognition or sequential cognition recognizes the generic nature of the object, which means it places it among the class of objects, right, from which it is inferred, but does not exist as such in objects for different classes. For example, the moon and stars are moving objects, and the Vindhyas, this is Maharshi Vedavyasa's example, is a class of non-moving objects. Verbal cognition is the object perceived by a competent authority and described through words with the intention of transferring that knowledge to another. So when the speaker has neither perceived nor inferred the object, the authority of verbal cognition fails. But it does not fail in the original speaker with reference to either the object of perception or inference. So the verbal cognition is conditional. Vachaspati Mishra clarifies, because it has its origin in the recognition of the relations established by the inferences of the original perceiver. It is only through inference that verbal cognition is possible. The inferred object is possessed of the characteristic that is desired to be known. So, verbal cognition, according to Maharshi Vedavyasa, is conditional upon the competent authority passing that information to you. Swami Satyananda, I love his explanations. They're so simple, so direct, so clear. Okay, he says direct cognition, inference and testimony are the sources of knowledge. So he says in this sutra, Patanjali is trying to explain what is direct perception, that is pramana. From the previous sutra, we already know that pramana is a vritti or a manifestation of the mind. And the mind can manifest right knowledge, but it can also manifest wrong knowledge, that is the fivefold vrittis, right? So the first one is pramana, but the second one is also wrong knowledge. So the mind can manifest right, but it can also manifest wrong. So how do we know what right knowledge is? That is the purpose of this sutra. Right knowledge is that which is gained from three sources, which is sense evidence, inference and testimony. Now, sense evidence comes from direct perception of an object. You see a flower, you smell it. You hear somebody say something. Now this works if your senses are intact, there are no defects, there are no errors. But sometimes our senses can also deceive us. A great example, for instance, is whenever we have these full moons and stuff that come up, you'll find them described as red moon, harvest moon, blue moon. Does the moon change color? It doesn't. But sometimes when you see it in the sky, it looks pink, it looks yellow, there's refraction, there are different, shades of light that reach us. So that is a defect of the sense organs, because the moon itself is not changing color. How do we know that the moon is not changing color? Anumana, inference. Whenever you see smoke on a mountain, you know there is fire, because it is generic knowledge. You know that whenever there is smoke, there is fire. So you know through reading or through the evidence of those who know, which is the third one, agama, testimony, that the moon doesn't change color. You know from reading, from science, from studies, you are inferring that there must be some phenomenon taking place because of which you are seeing the moon in different colors. Agama is testimony. It is useful when sense evidence is not available, and also if there are not sufficient grounds for inference. So then we depend on what others see. However, it is conditional on the other person being competent source of direct perception. So we trust, for instance, if you're reading a book by a scientist that says, no, the moon just doesn't change color, there is a specific phenomena, there's science, there's refraction, and therefore you see these colors. You say, oh, this person has studied, he's tested it, he's, used certain instruments and gained his own knowledge from it. How do you, take agama? When should you take agama? It has to fulfill two conditions. First, the person who's conveying the testimony to you should have right knowledge himself, and second, he should be able to transmit that knowledge without error. Under these conditions, agama can generate right knowledge. So in yoga, for instance, the authority is with the guru. He is agama because he knows correctly and he transmits correctly. Scriptures are also considered agama because they are considered to be the testimony of the rishis who have experimented themselves. Swami Vivekananda. So in this sutra, he gives a really nice explanation. He says direct perception, inference, and competent evidence are proofs. He says when two perceptions do not contradict each other, there is proof. So he says if I hear something and it contradicts something that I have previously perceived, then I do not believe it. So there are three kinds of proofs. Pratyaksham, what we see and feel. Anumana, inference, you see a sign and the thing is signified. And Aptavakyam, that is the direct perception of the yogi, of those who have seen the truth. The conditions are, it must be true knowledge, it must not contradict perceptions of the past, and it depends on the competence of the testifier. He says this depends necessarily on the character of the man. Now he says in other fields, maybe a great artist, an artist can produce great work and be a completely wicked person, and that is okay. But in religion, that is not possible. Okay? Because somebody who is wicked, somebody who has not necessarily gone through the purification processes, cannot reach or perceive the truth. Therefore, a person who is necessarily wicked is considered incompetent to give agama or testimony. So we have reached to see that the man who declares himself an apta or a witness, a testifier, is unselfish and holy. He has reached beyond the senses, that he does not contradict the past knowledge of humanity. And he says it's not that science has great discoveries, artists discover new things all the time. It isn't that something new should not be discovered. It is that if something is genuinely valid for humanity, it fits in with the stream of knowledge that is flowing from the past. Okay, and fourthly, any truth must have a possibility of verification. It is not true knowledge if somebody says, oh, I had this vision, okay, and I see this paradise, but none of you can verify it, only I can see it, then that is not true knowledge. If it is true knowledge, everybody should have equal capacity to verify it. The man must also have no selfish motive. He must show that he is super conscious. He must have given us something that we cannot get from our senses and which is also beneficial for the world, without contradicting other truths. And the man cannot be singular. He cannot be only I can see this. This is unique to me. Whatever is a truth should be equally accessible to all of humanity. Maybe not instantly, like, I'm sure what Swami Vivekananda means is, it's not like we all look up into the sky and we see the truth. But if I put in the same effort that the Buddha put in, or Adi Shankara put in, or followed a certain amount of direction, then I should be able to achieve a place where I'm able to see this truth. It should be accessible to me. And he says apta is a word that doesn't mean simply testifier. It also means one who has attained, the attained. Okay, so when we speak of testimony, agama, we're talking about people who have attained the knowledge, trusting them. B.K. Sanger translates it as, correct knowledge is direct, inferred, or proven as factual. Now, initially, individual perception should be checked by reason, logic, and then seen to correspond to traditional acquired wisdom, which is the same as what Swami Vivekananda says. And he says this process involves enlightened intelligence or buddhi. B.K. Sanger uses this sutra to explain what is this buddhi, this intelligence. Okay, and he says we think buddhi is a monolith. But if you separate it from the mind and the brain, he says, what is intelligence? Intelligence is basically electromagnetic waves of thought. Okay, it is non-manifest only in Atman or Purusha. Okay, its quality is inherent but dormant. So our first step is to awaken it, is to awaken buddhi, intelligence. How do we awaken it? We awaken it through asana. So in asana, he says it brings intelligence to the surface of the cellular body through stretching, and to the physiological body by maintaining the pose, by balance. So when we equalize the body in asana, okay, we are basically awakening intelligence and its ability to discriminate. Then we strive for that harmonious sort of pose, right? And this precise measuring and discriminating is the apprenticeship or culturing of intelligence, B.K. Sanger says. So it is pursued in the internal sheaths by pranayama, pratyahara, and the further limbs of the Ashtanga. Thus, discrimination is a weighing process. Okay, it's a balancing process, it's a weighing process, and therefore it is inherently dualistic. Whatever is wrong is discarded and whatever is correct is left behind, retained. So when discrimination has been cultivated and intelligence is full and bright, okay, the ego and the mind retreat, chitta becomes sharp and clear. But spiritual intelligence, he says, is only that which dawns when discrimination ends. Wisdom does not dwell in duality. So wisdom is not the thing that's going to help you decide which stock to invest in, whether to have a relationship with a person, whether to buy a house now, how to solve your relationship problems. Wisdom is not concerned with all of that. It is not mingled with Prakriti. Patanjali calls it exalted intelligence. Vivekaja Jnanam. Vivekaja Jnanam. That is exalted intelligence. Spiritual wisdom does not decide. It knows. It is not concerned with proofs. It is beyond time. However, the progressive refinement of intelligence is essential in the search of freedom. So we are not there yet. We don't have this exalted intelligence. But we are in a process through asana of refining our intelligence. All matter contains its own inherent capacity for intelligence. But only man has the capacity to awaken and culture it and transcend it. So, buddhi has the capacity to perceive itself, and its innate nature is honesty. So when you're awakening intelligence by knowing what is real knowledge, you're basically becoming clearer and more honest about what is the truth. It is the instrument that takes you towards the truth. So what is true about yourself and what is true about the world is a means by which to reach the truth. Osho says right knowledge has three sources: direct cognition, inference, and the words of the awakened ones. Now, pratyaksha, direct knowledge, is the first source of knowledge. It means a face-to-face encounter without any medium or mediator. Pratyaksha, he says, means that which is before the eyes. But he says this has been interpreted very wrongly. In fact, he's being more radical than the other gurus in this sutra. He says eyes themselves are a mediation. So if you're perceiving something through the eyes, you already have a bridge. So it cannot be direct perception. So you transcend the senses only in deep meditation. No senses are involved and nobody has reported it. This is immediacy, and only in immediacy you can get truth. So you may know the whole world through your sense organs, but if you do not know your innermost being, the core of your being, then that's absurd knowledge. Your whole edifice is false. So every dream is true while you dream it. And he gives this beautiful story, which is also a poem in Chinese, of Chuang-Tzu, the Chinese philosopher who dreamed that he was a butterfly. And when he woke up, he was very sad, and his students laughed at him and said, "Why are you so sad?" And he said, "Because I dreamed that I was a butterfly, and when I was dreaming, I thought it was true." And the students laughed and said, "So what's so funny about, what's so sad about it?" And he said, "Because now I'm awake. What if there's a butterfly somewhere dreaming that he is me?" You see? So there is no impossibility, Osho says. The reverse can occur. This is, therefore, you have to, the correct perception is that which is attained without the senses. The second source is inference, and he says you have no knowledge of your inner soul, for instance. And there are people like Engels and Marx and the Charvakas who decide that there is no soul. But Patanjali says if you know, there is no need to infer, but if you don't know, you can infer. And a great example that Osho gives is of René Descartes, who said, "I doubt, I think, therefore I am." And what he did is basically he began with doubt, and he went on until he reached a point. He went on inferring until he reached the point that he could no longer doubt. Okay? And he says this is what Patanjali says means by inference. And he says inference should lead you to a point of growth. It should lead you to an opening, not a dead end. And it is not whether your logic is perfect or not, but does your logic offer an opening. Agama is the words of those who have known, the words of the enlightened one. You cannot prove them, you cannot disprove them. You can only trust them. And trust, he says, is a hypothesis. It is a direction, it is a way of thinking, and it is scientific. You have to experiment. So if I decide to trust Patanjali, I walk on that path and I see if it works. If it doesn't work, I discard it. Patanjali is saying there are things you cannot know, you cannot infer, but that you have to take on trust. Barbara Stoller Miller keeps it very simple. She says one of 3 legitimate methods for accurately apprehending material reality. Thank you for listening. Please come back tomorrow for Sutra 8.